Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Mike Mena, currently a doctoral student of linguistic anthropology, bringing to you a chapter by chapter explanation of Foucault's History of Sexuality. I'm using the very common edition, so the page numbers refer to this one. So this YouTube series is geared toward advanced undergrad and grad level students. I'll do my best to stay within a reasonable academic register as far as vocabulary. Now I'm going to try to translate what Foucault is saying in easier terms, and I'll highlight frequently quoted sections so that maybe you can go to class and sound super smart as if you've always known this. Now, I make no claims to holding any final authoritative knowledge over Foucault, but I've been a reader of his for a while, and I've read most of his stuff, which I refer to sometimes, but I really try to stick to this book only. Now, today's video will have a short conversation on the title of the book. We're going to repeat the word discourse over and over and over, that way we can feel like we own it by the end of the video. And we will look at the introductory chapter, We the Other Victorians. Okay, so we might first think about the title, The History of Sexuality, which is not so much the history of sex, the act itself, but more so what kind of conversations were had that produced what we think of as sexuality. So what kind of conversations or discourses, which is a really tricky word. Now in this book, he goes over, for example, medical discourses about sex, religious or confessional discourses about sex. Now all these types of conversations or discourses would come to define what we know of as sexuality. Now, if I remember correctly, the French title is something like History of Sexuality, The Will to Knowledge, as opposed to the very generic English History of Sexuality, Volume 1. So, French, it was The Will to Knowledge. And this is referring to the desire to know what sex and sexuality is. Now, the way we know things is often we grab our pens and we put them to paper and we produce knowledge and contribute to the ongoing discourse about something. Okay, so that's hopefully an overview of the word discourse. Now, beginning with part 1, We the Other Victorians, which is the first chapter, Foucault considers the moment at one point in history where sex was not confined to secrecy or to the private realm or the parents' bedroom. In other words, a time before we supposedly repressed sex. Now today we still speak in these terms, that maybe this or that person or group is sexually repressed. So this is a discourse of repression. This in turn produces discourses of liberation. Since we assume we're repressed, then obviously we need to liberate ourselves. So on the bottom of page 8, now Foucault presents a very straightforward question, and it's one of the main ideas of the book, or maybe the main idea. So it's here kind of towards the bottom. The question I would like to pose is not why are we repressed, but rather why do we say with so much passion and so much resentment that we are repressed? So when we talk about sex and sexuality in terms of repression, there's a tendency to focus on what is taken away, what is outlawed, what is censored. Now, overall, this is a negative form of power. This is a power that says no. and this is opposed to a productive form of power, which we're going to talk about later in depth. But is this true? Can we somehow empirically know we are repressed? What we can be certain is that the talk about sexuality, where and when these conversations took place, were indeed relocated and reorganized, so that maybe instead of talking about it out in the open, it was confined to very specialized arenas like the couch of the psychoanalysis, or maybe the confessional at church. So instead of thinking about the absence of conversations about sex, or the overall general repression of sex, Foucault is suggesting we start talking about sex. Foucault is suggesting we started talking about sex in a lot of very specialized ways, like never before, through laws, through religion, particularly in science and in medicine. So instead of this total shutdown of conversations, there was, on the contrary, an incitement to discourse, which is the name of the next chapter. So, are we really repressed if we're always talking about sex in these new ways? Or at the very least, we're always talking about not talking about sex. So I'm going to leave you with a quote from page 11, and this is about middle of the page. Okay, so the central issue, then, at least in this first instance, is not to determine whether one says yes or no to sex, whether one formulates prohibitions or permissions, whether one asserts its importance or denies its effects, or whether one refines the words one uses to designate it, but to account for the fact that it is spoken about, to discover who does the speaking, the positions and viewpoints from which they speak, the institutions which prompt people to speak about it, and which store and distribute the things that are said. What is at issue, briefly, is the overall discursive fact, the way in which sex is put into discourse. Okay, so the next video, we go on to part 2 of the book, which is about this repressive hypothesis.